Hey guys, Metal Jesus here. Now I recently got tagged in a tweet that I thought would make a good video and also a good discussion for my audience. So let me read it to you. It was tweeted out by Ben Verspeak, and he asks, asking all retro gamers, what console or / 10 games would you recommend to someone looking to start collecting in 2019? Boy, that's a big question, and many of the answers were really fascinating. The first thing I would say is that, when you're asking somebody broadly, like, what should they collect? Well, that's almost like asking somebody, what music should I collect? Or what artwork should I collect? Or what movies should I collect? And it's so subjective. The answer, and I know it's a cop-out, but you should collect what you're passionate about. That's what's going to motivate you. That's what's going to get you excited. And so that's the very first thing I recommend is this, what are you passionate about? What gets you excited? What do you want to see on your shelves and in your collection? What is the state of game collecting in 2019? And it's different than it was last year, and it's different than it was certainly 5 years ago when it was starting to really gain in popularity. So looking at price charting, you start to get a sense that it's starting to plateau for a lot of those classic Nintendo systems and games that people were going for just 5 years ago. If you look at the NES and you look at the Super NES, the prices, especially for loose games, are relatively flat. They haven't really gone up much, they haven't gone down much in the last year or so. And I think that's to be expected. I know me personally, I have most of the NES and Super NES games that I'm looking for. As a matter of fact, when I go to expos and I go out to retro gaming stores, I don't even really look at them. I have the ones that I want, and I'm happy with that. I'm not a completionist. I'm not going for a complete copy or a complete collection of anything. And so for me, those really rare and hard to find games, for the most part, I'm not looking for. And I think a lot of game collectors like me are in that same boat when it comes to certain systems. And I think the NES and the Super NES are definitely in that category. And so that means that if you wanted to jump in on NES and Super NES collecting today, it might be a good time to do that. Or maybe some larger collectors are going to start thinning out their collection. Maybe they've played the games that they want. Maybe they decided that they don't need to have as many games. And so we could potentially see over the next 6 months or a couple years, maybe NES and Super NES starting to fall. I know that's kind of hard for some people to imagine because it's been going up so much lately, but remember that the Atari was super hot in the 90s, and then once those collectors got the games that they were passionate about, that market definitely went down. And so maybe we'll see that for the NES and Super NES and maybe Genesis and some of those, that era of consoles. One area that might be kind of interesting over the next year or two is N64 and PlayStation 1 collecting. For a long time, those two systems were mostly ignored, but it seems like lately there's been a little bit of an uptick. Not a lot, but you're definitely starting to see more interest in those two systems. And so, again, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next year or so. I don't think the prices are crazy. It seems like that they're still plentiful to be found. And again, keep in mind that if you're going for just loose, you can obviously save way more money than complete in box. I know for me personally on the N64, that's what I go for. I have a handful of complete in box N64 games, but these are actually mostly by accident. I often go for the loose carts because that's all I really care about. I just want to play the games. And now with the PlayStation 1, obviously most of the cases are going to be included, but you can significantly save money if you just want the CDs. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, Kelsey had a really interesting response to this. I'd like to read it to you. It says, easy ones to start collecting are PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, original Xbox, and Xbox 360. Lots of quality games for fairly cheap and usually huge selections to find at both game stores and swap meets. This is a great point here, is that in general, the previous generation to what we're currently in is often very reasonably priced and sometimes incredibly cheap. That's because people aren't really nostalgic for it. Now, I get it, this isn't really retro, but you have to kind of think long term. I certainly do, because I remember very vividly when it was the last week of GameCube games that GameStop was selling in their stores, and they were blowing them out, buy two, get two free. Imagine that. So if you buy two used GameCube games, you got two of them for free. And I bought a lot of my collection that week. I basically filled out all this extra stuff. And I think that we're probably another year away from that same thing happening with the previous generation. Not so much the PlayStation 2, because GameStop doesn't sell those, obviously, but the PlayStation 3, the Wii, and also the Xbox 360. Right now, those can be found plentiful. There are probably half a dozen GameStops in the Seattle area, and you could very easily build up a sizable PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 collection for not that much money. But the moment that they take those off the shelves and stop selling them, at least in the United States here, I suspect you are going to see prices for some of the exclusives and some of the more beloved games start to shoot up, just like we did with the GameCube and also some of the PlayStation 2 games. I mean, in general, PlayStation 2, like Kelsey said, is pretty reasonable, but a lot of those RPGs are kind of expensive now, and it's because they're getting hard to find. And speaking of Xbox, I do want to mention something. I do think that now might be the time to jump in on the Xbox One, and specifically here I have the Xbox One X. Now you're probably saying, why? Well, that's because, like I mentioned previously, Microsoft has done a fantastic job with backwards compatibility. So let's say you want to start collecting for the original Xbox, or you want to start collecting Xbox 360 games. Well, the Xbox One X runs a lot of those, and it runs them way better than the original hardware, because Microsoft has tweaked a lot of those to upscale to 4K. Some of them are enhanced for the Xbox One X and maybe have higher well, obviously 4K, so higher resolution, but also higher textures, higher frame rates. So for me personally, when it comes time to be playing my original Xbox games, I do check to see if it's compatible with the Xbox One X, because it's probably going to run better, and it's outputting to HDMI, so it looks fantastic on my 4K television. So something to consider. Also, speaking of the Xbox One X, it is technically the most powerful console currently on the market. So in addition to all the backwards compatibility, a lot of third-party games, like say Red Dead Redemption 2, run best and look best on the Xbox One X. So I personally think it's actually a really great console. It fits nicely with my PlayStation 4 Pro and also my Switch. But what about handhelds? Well, I really love the Nintendo 3DS for many, many reasons. The number one reason really being is that it's a great handheld. There's tons of great games for it, but more importantly, it provides a very unique gaming experience that you can't quite get if you try to emulate it, or if you try to get some sort of port to, like, say, the Switch. I mean, it's just a fantastic console, and who knows how long it's going to be in stores. I think it's probably got maybe another year before GameStop's just officially kill it off. So now is the time to jump in on this, because I've tried to play emulation on some of the stuff, and using your computer and a mouse to emulate the touchscreen often is not great. And I am one of those people who, I do like to check out the 3D on a lot of these games. Sometimes it's really cool, and you can't really get that on any other platform. So I don't know, I really enjoyed the 3DS. It also plays DS games, which is a really nice feature. So really you have thousands of games available for this, and I highly recommend you go out and buy one while you can. And speaking of, at least here in North America, while most of the GameStops don't sell Vita games anymore, but there seem, at least in the Seattle area, it's hit or miss. Some of the larger stores still have Vita games, and many of them still sell the consoles. Now, I talk a lot about the Vita, and the reason why I do is because I do feel like it's one of the best handhelds ever made, bar none. It's sad that Sony couldn't quite market it and it couldn't really find that mass audience that they were looking for, but I highly recommend people check it out. If you've never played a Vita, hold one in your hands. You're going to be amazed by the power. You're going to be amazed by the comfort of it. When you play games with it, you know, it's got 2 physical thumbsticks. It feels like a full-blown gaming console in your hand. It's absolutely fantastic. And so I would be remiss if I didn't mention my beloved PlayStation Vita. You did ask about retro, and I talked a little bit about the NES and Super NES and the Genesis, stuff like that. But I do want to mention the previous generation to that a little bit. Now, I get it. I'm old, and I loved the Atari, but I'm also fully aware that if you are in your 20s or 30s, it may be more difficult for you as a gamer and a collector to go back and maybe appreciate the Atari 2600 like I do. I get it. It's very primitive by today's standards, especially with its 1-button joystick and its fairly simple gameplay. So that said, I think there is a lot of joy in being a collector and going for some of those experiences that are maybe new to you and perhaps a little bit alien and a little bit funky. And that's where I want to mention the Intellivision. I did not grow up with an Intellivision. I don't really have nostalgia for this at all. But as a collector, I found this at an estate sale years ago, didn't pay very much money for it. And it's just really fun to bring something home that is completely alien to you, hook it up and experience it as though it came out today, you know? And the Intellivision is a nice one for that because it is a generation better than the Atari 2600. The games are a little bit more complex. The graphics are a little bit better. And the other thing I want to say about this too is that often the games are super cheap. Not only just for the Intellivision, but also the ColecoVision. 99% of them you can just buy for $1 or $2, maybe $5 max. Often many of the Intellivision games come complete in their box with their little overlays and all that stuff. And it's just really fun to have some of these weirder, I shouldn't call the Intellivision weird, but to me, it's a little bit stranger than maybe what you're used to, and there's a lot of joy to be had from that. Same, like I mentioned, the ColecoVision. The games are definitely better in graphics than they were to the Atari 2600, and you know the controllers just feel different, and they're just a whole other experience. So sometimes it's really fun to take a chance on something like that. The Vectrex is another great example of something that's like, wow, what is this, you know? And as long as it doesn't cost too much, sometimes it's fun to just take a chance. You may have noticed I haven't really touched on computers, and that's because they're just not going to be for everybody. I think if you are a young person and you don't have any experience with a Commodore 64 or running command lines in MS-DOS, the learning curve can be fairly high. That said, there is a lot of joy to be had when collecting old computer games. And by computer, I mean, you know, Commodore 64, Amiga, Atari ST, Apple, I mean, again, MS-DOS, all that stuff. And what I would probably recommend you do before you jump in on that, because that can just take over your life, and like I said, the learning curve is huge, check out some emulators. A lot of those 80s and 90s computers are well emulated on modern operating systems. So you can get a Commodore 64 emulator or an Amiga emulator or an Apple emulator and check it out and see if it's something that you're interested. I mean, you never know. All right, guys. Well, obviously this is a huge question. I didn't even really get into, like, say, the 10 games that you should potentially get because, well, it all really depends on the system that you're going to collect for. So, but I'd love to know down in the comments if you were to give some advice to someone who is going to start collecting in 2019, what do you recommend? It's a tough one, but it's really fun to discuss it. Love to know what you guys think. As always, guys, I want to thank you for watching my channel. Thank you for subscribing, and take care.